Sarah's hands were still shaking on the steering wheel when she saw him standing there impossibly in the middle of Route 49. His milky eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, as if he'd been waiting for her specifically, and that's when she knew her life would never be the same. The old man stood motionless in the wash of her headlights, wearing the same tattered overalls she'd seen on him 3 hours earlier when she'd driven past, except now he was 30 miles away from where she'd first spotted him, and there was no possible way he could have gotten here on foot. The night air through her cracked window carried the smell of turned earth and something else, something metallic and wrong that made her stomach clench. She should have kept driving that first time, should have ignored the way he'd raised his gnarled hand slowly, deliberately, beckoning her to stop with fingers that bent at angles that fingers shouldn't bend. But she'd been raised to help people, to stop for stranded motorists on these lonely Arkansas backroads. And now, as she sat frozen in her Honda Civic, with the engine idling, and that thing wearing a man's skin staring at her with eyes that reflected her headlights like an animal is, she understood with cold certainty that some instincts exist to keep us alive, and she'd ignored every single one of them. The first time Sarah had seen the old man was around 6 in the evening, just as the October sun was painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. She'd been driving back from Little Rock to her family's farm outside of Mena, taking the scenic route through Polk County because the highway traffic had been unbearable, and she'd wanted to clear her head after a frustrating week at the insurance office. Route 49 wound through dense pine forests and past abandoned farmhouses with sagging roofs and kudzu-strangled porches, the kind of country where cell phone service came and went like a bad radio signal. She'd been alone on the road for nearly 20 minutes when she'd rounded a curve and seen him standing on the shoulder, his body partially hidden by the lengthening shadows of the tree line. He was tall, impossibly thin, with skin that had the waxy quality of old paper. His face was gaunt, cheekbones jutting out sharply, and his eyes were a pale, clouded blue that seemed to catch the dying light and hold it. He wore faded denim overalls, over a shirt that might have once been white, but was now the color of old bones, and his bare feet were caked with red clay that looked wet and fresh, despite the fact that it hadn't rained in over a week. As Sarah's car approached, he'd lifted his right hand in that slow, deliberate gesture, his mouth opening to reveal gaps where teeth should have been, and though she couldn't hear him through her closed windows, she could see his lips forming a single word, over and over. Stop. Something about the way he moved made Sarah's foot ease off the accelerator instinctively. There was a wrongness to him, a quality she couldn't quite name, but felt in her bones the way animals sense earthquakes before they strike. His joints seemed to move with a slight delay, as if his body was receiving signals from somewhere far away. His head tilted at an angle that was just a few degrees too severe to be natural, and his eyes never blinked not once in the entire time she'd watched him in her rearview mirror as she'd sped past. She'd felt those eyes on her even after she'd rounded the next bend and lost sight of him, felt them boring into the back of her skull like cold fingers pressing against bone. The sensation had made her shoulders tense, had made her check her mirrors compulsively for the next 10 miles, half expecting to see him somehow keeping pace with her car, his impossibly long legs eating up the distance in strides that defied physics and reason. But the road behind her had remained empty, just a ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into the gathering dusk, and she told herself she was being ridiculous, that living alone in the city had made her paranoid, that he was just some unfortunate homeless man or a farmer who'd wandered away from his property, confused and lost. She'd been thinking about stopping for coffee in Hatfield when she'd seen him the second time, standing in exactly the same position on the shoulder, hand raised in that beckoning gesture, mouth forming that same silent word. But this time, she was on Highway 71, a completely different route, at least 30 miles from where she'd first encountered him. Sarah's heart had begun to pound then, a sick, heavy rhythm that made her breath come short and fast. She'd glanced at her speedometer, confirming she'd been driving at a steady 60 miles per hour for the past 40 minutes, and there was absolutely no way the old man could have gotten ahead of her, unless he'd sprouted wings or teleported. The rational part of her brain tried to supply explanations, tried to tell her it was a different person who just happened to look similar, that the fading light was playing tricks on her eyes. but she knew with the certainty of prey, recognizing a predator, that it was the same man, the same creature, the same impossible thing that had locked onto her somehow, and was now tracking her movements with an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry. This time Sarah hadn't even considered slowing down. She'd pressed the accelerator to the floor, her Civic's engine whining in protest as she pushed it to 80, then 85, the trees on either side of the road blurring into a dark tunnel. She'd fumbled for her phone with one hand, trying to call her father, but her screen showed no signal, just a maddening circle that spun and spun without connecting. The old man had grown smaller in her rearview mirror, but just before she'd lost sight of him, she'd seen him turn his head to follow her trajectory, his movements smooth and predatory, and she'd sworn she'd seen his lips pull back in something that might have been a smile if smiles were supposed to make you feel like your insides were turning to ice water. The sun had fully set by then, and the road ahead was illuminated only by her headlights and the occasional reflective marker painting everything in harsh contrasts of light and shadow that made the familiar landscape feel alien and threatening. Sarah had been gripping the steering wheel so hard, her knuckles had gone white when she'd entered the outskirts of Mina, the first streetlights in miles appearing like beacons of civilization and safety. She'd started to breathe easier, started to tell herself she'd imagined the whole thing, that stress and fatigue had conspired to create a phantom from nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence. She'd stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, a rundown place with flickering fluorescent lights, and a clerk who'd looked at her with bored disinterest when she'd stumbled inside, her legs shaky and weak. The bathroom mirror had shown her own face pale and drawn her eyes too wide, and she'd splashed cold water on her cheeks, trying to ground herself in the mundane reality of soap dispensers and paper towels, and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. When she'd returned to her car, she'd sat in the driver's seat for a full 5 minutes, telling herself she was fine, that she was safe, that old men couldn't teleport, and whatever she'd seen was easily explainable in the bright, rational light of day. But then she'd seen him in the gas station's security mirror, standing motionless in the darkness beyond the reach of the parking lot, lights his pale eyes reflecting like coins in the blackness, and she'd realized with dawning horror that stopping had been the worst mistake she could have made. The moment she'd pulled into that parking lot, the moment her car had come to a complete stop, she'd done exactly what he'd been asking her to do all along. She'd given him what he wanted. The clerk had noticed nothing when Sarah had burst back through the door, had barely looked up from his phone when she'd babbled something about a creepy guy in the parking lot, had just shrugged and said something about chasing off tweakers being part of the job. But when she'd worked up the courage to look again, the old man had vanished, and the parking lot had been empty except for a semi-truck and an abandoned shopping cart rolling slowly across the pavement in the evening breeze. Sarah had driven the final 12 miles to her family's farm, with her doors locked and her high beams on, checking her mirrors so frequently she'd nearly run off the road twice. The farmhouse had appeared ahead like salvation, its porch light glowing warm and yellow. Her father's truck parked in its usual spot near the barn. She'd pulled into the driveway fast enough to spray gravel had practically run to the front door, had felt the tension in her shoulders only begin to ease when she'd stepped into the familiar smell of her mother's cooking and heard the television playing in the living room. Her father had looked up from his recliner, had started to smile in greeting, but the smile had faded when he'd seen her face. He'd asked what was wrong, his voice carrying that note of concern that fathers master when their children are in distress, and Sarah had started to explain, had started to tell him about the old man on the road. But the words had died in her throat when she'd glanced out the window behind him and seen a figure standing at the edge of their property, barely visible in the darkness, its pale eyes catching the light from the house and throwing it back like mirrors. Her father had followed her gaze, had squinted into the darkness, but by the time he'd reached the window, the figure had disappeared. He'd told her it was probably a deer or maybe old man Henderson from the next property over, had suggested she was working too hard and needed rest, and Sarah had wanted desperately to believe him, had wanted to convince herself that exhaustion and imagination had created monsters from shadows. She'd gone to bed in her childhood room with its faded wallpaper and the posters she'd never taken down, had locked the door and checked under the bed and in the closet like she was 8 years old again, and had finally drifted into an uneasy sleep around midnight. her phone clutched in one hand despite the useless "no service" message that still blinked on its screen. She'd woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of knocking, not the sharp rap of knuckles on wood, but a slow, deliberate tapping that seemed to come from her window. Sarah had lain frozen in bed, her heart hammering against her ribs, telling herself it was a branch, just a branch moved by the wind, except there was no wind, and the tree nearest her window had been cut down 2 years ago, after lightning had split it down the middle. The tapping had continued, patient and rhythmic, and when she'd finally worked up the courage to look, she'd seen him standing in her backyard, his face pressed against the glass, his breath fogging the window in slow, deliberate clouds. His eyes had been wide and unblinking, and his mouth had been moving, still forming that same word over and over, and even though she couldn't hear him through the glass, she'd understood with terrible clarity what he was saying. "Let me in. Let me in. Let me in." Sarah had screamed then, had screamed loud enough to wake her parents, had screamed until her father had burst through the door with a baseball bat, and her mother had fumbled for the light switch. But when they'd looked out the window, there had been nothing there, just the empty yard and the distant tree line, and the stars wheeling overhead in their cold, indifferent patterns. Her father had checked the locks, had walked the perimeter of the house with a flashlight, had found nothing but some disturbed leaves near the window that could have been from anything. He'd tried to comfort her, had suggested a doctor's appointment to check for anxiety, and Sarah had seen the worry in her mother's eyes and understood that they thought she was having some kind of breakdown, that the stress of her job and living alone had finally caught up with her. The next morning, Sarah had found muddy footprints on the porch, bare feet with toes that were too long and spread too wide, prints that tracked from the driveway to her window and then disappeared without explanation. She'd taken pictures with her phone, had shown them to her father over breakfast, but he'd frowned and said they looked like they'd been there a while, probably, from when Henderson had stopped by last week to return a borrowed tool. The explanation didn't account for the fact that the mud was fresh and red, the same color as the clay that had caked the old man's feet, or that Henderson wore size 10 work boots, and the prints were at least size 13. But her father had already dismissed the subject and moved on to talk about harvest yields and equipment repairs. Sarah had left for Little Rock that afternoon, had told herself she'd be safer in the city, surrounded by people and light and the constant noise of traffic. But as she'd driven north on Highway 71, she'd seen him again, standing beside the road in a different location, his hand raised in that familiar beckoning gesture. This time she'd kept her foot on the accelerator, had refused to even slow down, but as she'd passed him, she'd felt something change in the air, had felt a coldness settle over her skin that had nothing to do with the October weather. And when she'd glanced in her rearview mirror, she'd seen him turn to watch her go, his head rotating further than any human neck should rotate, nearly 180 degrees, his eyes still locked on her car. The drive back to her apartment should have taken 2.5 hours. It took 4 because Sarah found herself taking detours, found herself unable to trust the direct route, found herself constantly checking her mirrors and jumping at shadows. When she finally pulled into her apartment complex's parking garage, the relief had been so intense it had made her dizzy. She'd sat in her car for 10 minutes, gathering her courage before finally making the dash to the elevator. The fluorescent lights had flickered as she'd waited, casting everything in a strobing, nauseating pulse, and she'd sworn she'd seen a tall figure at the far end of the garage, standing motionless in the shadows between 2 SUVs. But when she'd looked directly at the spot, there had been nothing there. Her apartment had felt like a fortress, 3 stories up with a deadbolt and a chain lock, and neighbors on all sides. Sarah had checked every room, had looked in every closet and behind every door, and had finally allowed herself to relax when she'd confirmed she was alone. She'd made dinner, had tried to watch television, had attempted to convince herself that whatever had happened on those rural roads couldn't follow her here, to the city, to civilization. But at 10 o'clock, as she'd been getting ready for bed, her doorbell had rung. The sound had made her freeze, her toothbrush still in her mouth, because nobody had buzzed from the lobby, which meant whoever was at her door had gotten into the building somehow. She'd crept to the peephole, her heart pounding, and had seen nothing but the empty hallway with its beige carpet and its flickering overhead light. The doorbell had rung again and then again, each ring longer than the last, and Sarah had backed away from the door, had grabbed her phone to call the police, but before she could dial, there had come a different sound, a slow, deliberate knocking that seemed to shake the entire frame. And then she'd heard it, muffled through the door, but unmistakable, a voice like wind through dead leaves, like stones scraping against stones. "I saw you looking. You looked at me. You stopped your car. Let me in." Sarah had called 911, had whispered frantically into the phone about an intruder, about being followed, about a man who couldn't possibly be real, but was somehow standing outside her door 3 stories up in a building with locked entrances. The dispatcher had been calm and professional, had said officers were on their way, had told Sarah to stay on the line and not open the door under any circumstances. But the knocking had continued, had grown more insistent, and Sarah had heard something else too, a wet, sliding sound, like something moving across the door's surface, and she'd realized with mounting horror that he was pressed against it, that his face was probably inches from hers with only the wood and the deadbolt between them. When the police had arrived 15 minutes later, they'd found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints in the hallway, no evidence that anyone had been at her door. The officers had been kind but skeptical, had suggested she might have heard a neighbor, had recommended she call the building's security office if she felt unsafe. One of them had given her a card for a therapist who specialized in anxiety and PTSD, and Sarah had seen them exchange a look that said more clearly than words that they thought she was crying wolf, that she was wasting their time with paranoid delusions. After they'd left, Sarah had dragged her couch across the living room and wedged it against the front door. She'd turned on every light in the apartment, had checked and rechecked the locks on her windows, and had finally collapsed on her bed fully clothed, too terrified to sleep, but too exhausted to stay awake. She drifted in and out of consciousness, jerking awake at every sound, every creak of the building settling, every distant siren. At some point in the darkest part of the night, she'd heard scratching at her bedroom window, impossible, because she was on the 3rd floor, and there was no fire escape, no balcony, nothing that could support a person's weight. But when she'd forced herself to look, she'd seen fingers pressed against the glass, long and pale, and ending in nails that were too yellow and too thick, and beyond the fingers, she'd seen his face, that terrible face with its clouded eyes, and its gaps where teeth should be, and his mouth had been moving in that same silent chant, "Let me in." Sarah had spent the rest of the night huddled in her bathroom, with the door locked and a kitchen knife clutched in her shaking hands. And when morning had finally come and sunlight had streamed through her apartment windows, she'd emerged to find scratches on the glass of her bedroom window, long gouges that looked like they'd been made by fingernails or claws. She'd taken pictures, had documented everything, and had made a decision that she knew might sound crazy, but felt like her only option. She needed to find out what this thing was and how to make it stop, because going to the police again would accomplish nothing except maybe getting her committed for psychiatric evaluation. She'd started researching online, typing variations of Old Man Ghost, Rural Roads, and Entity That Follows You Home into search engines, wading through pages of creepypasta and urban legends and forum posts from people who were clearly either making things up or genuinely delusional. But then she'd found something, a post on a paranormal investigation board from someone in Missouri, describing an encounter with a tall, thin man in overalls who'd appeared on back roads, who'd gestured for people to stop, who'd followed those who'd acknowledged him back to their homes. The post was 5 years old, and the person who'd written it, username Midnight Drifter 88, had described exactly what Sarah was experiencing: the teleportation, the impossible appearances, the sense of being hunted. The post ended with a simple line: "If you see him, don't stop, don't look. Don't acknowledge his existence in any way. Once you do, he knows you can see him and he'll never stop following you until he gets what he wants." But what did he want? Sarah had scrolled through the replies, had found dozens of similar stories from across the rural South and Midwest, all describing the same figure, the same methods, the same relentless pursuit. One person from Tennessee had written about how their uncle had encountered the old man in 1987 and had made the mistake of giving him a ride, and how the uncle had been found 3 days later, wandering in the woods completely catatonic, and had never spoken another word for the remaining 12 years of his life. Another poster from Oklahoma had described their sister's experience, how she'd stopped to help what she thought was a stranded motorist, and had ended up in a psych ward after clawing her own eyes out, screaming about his eyes in my eyes looking out through me. The stories went on, and they all had one thing in common. Nobody who'd acknowledged the old man, nobody who'd stopped or looked directly at him or responded to his beckoning, had ever escaped completely. The best outcomes involved moving far away, sometimes to other countries, and even then some people reported occasional glimpses, moments where they'd see him in crowds or reflections or standing at the edges of their vision. Sarah had felt her hope crumbling as she'd read, had felt the weight of her mistakes settling over her like a shroud. She'd stopped her car. She'd looked at him. She'd paused at that gas station, had given him an invitation through her acknowledgement, and now he would follow her forever, would appear in her windows, and at her doors would scratch at the glass and whisper. His demands would wait with the patience of something that existed outside normal time and space, until finally she either let him in or went completely insane from the constant siege. The only other option, according to one post that had received multiple confirmations, was to confront him directly, to face him and somehow convince him to break the connection. But nobody who'd tried that approach had ever come back to report on whether it worked, which Sarah suspected meant it definitely didn't work. She'd been sitting at her computer, trying to decide whether to quit her job and flee to another state or another country, when her phone had rung. The number had been local but unfamiliar, and she'd answered it with a shaking hand to hear an old woman's voice, papery and thin, asking if she was Sarah Mitchell. When Sarah had confirmed, the woman had identified herself as Mrs. Henderson, wife of the neighbor who lived adjacent to her parents' farm, and she'd said something that had made Sarah's blood run cold. "I wanted to warn you, dear. My husband saw someone walking around your folks' property last night. Tall fellow, very thin, wearing old farm clothes. He was just standing in the yard, staring at the house. Herman went out to ask if he needed help, but the man disappeared soon as Herman got close. Strangest thing. Wanted to make sure you knew in case he was some kind of prowler." Sarah had thanked her and hung up, had immediately tried calling her parents, but the call had gone straight to voicemail, which was odd because her father always kept his phone charged and nearby. She'd tried her mother's number with the same result, and panic had begun to claw at her throat with sharp insistence. The drive from Little Rock to Mena suddenly felt impossibly long, and she'd grabbed her keys and her phone and had been halfway to the door when she'd realized what she was about to do. Drive back to those rural roads, back to the old man's territory, back to the place where he seemed strongest. Every instinct screamed at her to stay in the city, to call the police and let them check on her parents. But what would she tell them? That a supernatural entity was stalking her family because she'd made eye contact with it on a country road. The drive to Mena was the longest of Sarah's life. She'd left at noon, hoping the bright daylight would offer some protection, some shield against the thing that seemed to prefer twilight and darkness. She'd taken Highway 71 this time, had avoided Route 49 entirely, had kept her eyes fixed rigidly on the road ahead, refusing to look at the shoulders or the tree lines, or anywhere the old man might be standing. Her phone had remained stubbornly dead, no service despite passing through areas where she'd had bars before, and she'd wondered if he could somehow interfere with signals, could create a bubble of isolation around her that cut her off from help. The other cars on the highway had been scarce, and the few she'd passed had seemed somehow wrong, their drivers staring straight ahead with blank expressions, their vehicles moving with mechanical precision that looked more like programming than human control. She'd been 40 minutes from Mena, the sun still high in the sky, when she'd rounded a curve and seen him standing in the middle of the highway exactly as he'd been the night before, his hand raised in that beckoning gesture. Sarah had slammed on the brakes instinctively, her Civic's tires screaming against the asphalt, and that was the moment she'd realized her terrible mistake. She'd stopped again, had done exactly what every warning had told her not to do, and now, as the old man began to walk toward her car with movements that were smooth and gliding and wrong, she understood that this time there would be no driving away, no escape, because his patience had finally run out, and he was coming to collect whatever price she'd agreed to pay when she'd first met his eyes. And that's when Sarah found herself here, in this moment, watching him approach through her windshield, with her hands frozen on the steering wheel, and her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The old man's feet didn't quite touch the ground as he moved, she realized, his bare soles hovering a fraction of an inch above the pavement, and his body left no shadow despite the afternoon sun. His face was even more terrible up close, the skin translucent enough to show the darkness underneath, his eyes not just clouded but wrong somehow, as if they were looking at her from multiple directions at once, as if they could see not just her present, but her past and future too. He reached her car door and pressed his palm against the window, and Sarah could see through his skin to the bones beneath, could see that there was something moving under his flesh, something that writhed and pulsed with its own separate life. His mouth opened wider than any human mouth should open, revealing not a throat but a darkness that seemed to extend far beyond the physical space his body could contain, and his voice, when it came, was not from his mouth, but from everywhere at once, from inside her car and inside her head and from the very air itself. You saw me. You looked at me. You stopped for me. 3 times you acknowledged me. 3 times you invited me. Now you have to let me in. Sarah tried to start the car, tried to shift into reverse, but her hands wouldn't obey her commands. Her muscles frozen by something beyond simple fear. The old man's fingers began to press through the glass of her window as if it were water, as if the solid barrier between them was nothing but a suggestion he could choose to ignore. And Sarah could feel coldness radiating from him, could feel the temperature in her car dropping until her breath was visible, until frost began to form on the inside of her windshield. She wanted to scream but couldn't find her voice, wanted to move but was locked in place. And she realized with terrible clarity that this was how it ended, that all the warnings and all the research and all her desperate attempts to escape had been futile because you couldn't run from something that existed outside the normal rules of reality, something that could be in multiple places at once, something that had marked her the moment she'd met its eyes. The old man's hand was inside her car now, his fingers impossibly long and reaching for her face, and Sarah could see her reflection in his clouded eyes, could see herself growing smaller and more distant, as if she were falling away into the darkness behind those awful eyes. She closed her own eyes, unable to watch her own consumption, and waited for whatever came next, waited for the touch of those fingers and the cold that would surely follow, waited for the end of her story and the beginning of whatever existence awaited those who let the old man in. But the touch never came. Instead, Sarah felt warmth, felt sunlight on her face, and when she opened her eyes she was still in her car, but the old man was gone, and the road ahead was empty. Her watch showed that 3 hours had passed, though it had felt like only seconds, and the sun was low in the sky now, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. Her hands were still on the steering wheel, her car still idling in the middle of Highway 71, and when she looked in her rearview mirror, she saw him standing far behind her, already growing smaller with distance, his hand raised in what might have been a wave, or might have been a threat, or might have been a promise. Sarah drove the rest of the way to her parents' farm in a daze, her mind unable to process what had happened or what it meant. When she arrived, she found her parents sitting on the porch, her father reading the newspaper, and her mother shelling peas, both of them, looking at her with expressions of mild concern when she stumbled from her car, her legs barely supporting her weight. They asked where she'd been, said she looked terrible, said they'd been worried when she hadn't answered their calls. But when Sarah checked her phone, she found dozens of missed calls and texts, all of them from hours ago when she'd thought she had no service. Time had slipped somehow, had bent around whatever had happened on that highway, and Sarah realized she couldn't begin to explain what she'd experienced because she didn't understand it herself. That night, lying in her childhood bed, Sarah heard no tapping at her window, no whispered demands to let him in. The old man didn't appear in her yard or press his face against her glass. But she knew with bone-deep certainty that he wasn't gone, that he would never be gone, that she'd see him again on some future road or standing in some future crowd or reflected in some future mirror. She'd looked at him, had stopped for him, had acknowledged his existence, and that was a debt that could never be fully paid, only postponed, only delayed, only pushed into the future, like a bill that would eventually come due. And sometimes late at night when she's driving alone on empty roads, Sarah sees him in her peripheral vision, standing at the edge of the light, his hand raised in that familiar beckoning gesture. She never stops now, never slows, never meets his eyes, but she knows he's waiting, patient as stone, eternal as the darkness between stars, ready for the moment when she makes another mistake, another acknowledgement, another invitation. Because once you've seen the old man, once you've stopped for the old man, once you've let him know that you know he exists, you're marked forever. A name written in his ledger. A debt that will someday have to be collected, whether in this life or the next, or in whatever strange spaces exist between the two.